All right, welcome back, part two. Just a couple more slides to get through here. And I want to talk about specifically what's going on in the brain when we are experiencing stress or the opposite, happiness. We're going to talk a little bit about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, not exclusively the brain. But let's jump into the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is a tiny little structure in the limbic system, and it has a huge role in how we experience happiness. So the nucleus accumbens, and I guess before we jump into this, I want to say that don't misinterpret this, don't oversimplify the role that the nucleus accumbens has. There's no one-to-one relationship between a structure and an emotion or a thought or a mental ability, meaning you can't point to one tiny specific part of the brain and say, this part of the brain does this. It's usually way more complicated than that. It's not that simple. Usually what we find is there's one part of the brain that plays a really big role in a specific process or a specific emotion, but pretty quickly we find that it's the relationship between that particular part of the brain and other structures in the brain that causes the emotion or the mental process that we're interested in. So don't take away from this part of the lecture that the nucleus accumbens is responsible for happiness or something like that. It plays a big role, absolutely, but it's not the only part of the puzzle. Okay, so back to the nucleus accumbens. What we find is that when we are happy, there is increased activity in the nucleus accumbens. So this tiny little structure here, you can kind of see it in this cross section hanging out just inside the limbic system. And it's just right there. So when we're happy, there's a lot of action potentials going on in the nucleus accumbens. There's a lot of electrical activity that we can see on fMRIs and things like that. If you have a laboratory critter and you stick an electrode into the nucleus accumbens and you send electrical activity down that electrode, that critter will experience happiness. So if you artificially stimulate it, then that critter will have happy feelings. So we've got a pretty good case here that the nucleus accumbens plays a big role in how we experience happiness. Dopamine is another key part of this puzzle. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. You've probably heard of dopamine. We talked about it earlier on in different lectures. And you've probably also heard it just, in the news. You've probably heard it in TV shows and movies. A lot of people like to point to it as the happiness hormone or the happiness neurotransmitter. But again, it's not so simple. It's not like you can just increase the amount of dopamine in your brain and you will experience more happiness. It's much more complex than that. So, first of all, I want to talk about the difference between how addicts and non-addicts, or people with addiction and people without addiction, how they experience dopamine. So if you are someone who suffers from addiction, let's say to heroin, and if you are in the presence of heroin, so if you see heroin, your nucleus accumbens is going to release a lot of dopamine. There's going to be a lot of dopamine in your system simply because of the presence of the substance that you're addicted to. If you're someone who does not suffer from a heroin addiction, you will not have the same effect. You won't have dopamine released into your system just because of the presence of heroin. So what this means is that we see that addiction is particularly difficult to get rid of because addicts are getting a high just from the presence of the substance they're addicted to. It's a very tricky thing. If the nucleus accumbens becomes damaged, if it becomes lesioned, then we actually see the drug addiction disappear. And we've done this in laboratory animals before. We get them addicted to substances, and then we lesion their nucleus accumbens, and that drug addiction disappears. Again, it seems like a quick, simple fix, but I don't know if you'd want to go and just lesion your nucleus accumbens to get rid of an addiction. You might not be able to experience happiness anymore after that. Another time that we see a huge release of dopamine is when we expect a benefit. I'm talking specifically here about the placebo effect. I'm sure you're all aware of what the placebo effect is. It's when you see a positive impact, despite the fact that what you've just been given is a sugar pill or a saline injection. So there's no reason that you should see a benefit that you're expecting, but because you're expecting that benefit, you get that benefit. So the placebo effect and the nucleus accumbens and dopamine, there seems to be a relationship between these three. So in the nucleus accumbens, there's a large dopamine release when people who suffer from addiction are in the presence of the substance they're addicted to. There's a large dopamine release when we feel happy, and there's a large dopamine release when we are expecting a benefit, like the placebo effect. There's also a large release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens when we are laughing, when we are doing that full-bellied, completely genuine and honest type of laughing. So I've got a short video here on the Canvas course website, kind of asking this question: is this a treatment for addiction? Because there are some people out there who think that it could be, and they're actually taking steps to use laughter as a treatment for addiction. And that's what that short video is all about. So go ahead and watch that. Pretty interesting. All right, and I want to finish up by talking about happiness and specifically subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is sort of our operational definition for happiness. It's a really easy way to measure happiness, and it seems to be a pretty accurate and powerful way to measure happiness, at least from a scientific standpoint. So subjective well-being is simply your sense of satisfaction with life or a feeling of happiness. And you can measure subjective well-being like right now in this moment. You can ask someone, what's your subjective well-being over the last day, over the last 3 days, over the last week, over the last month, over the last year, or even over your entire life up until this point. And it's pretty straightforward. You can ask them on a scale of 1 to 10. And just like any measure of a psychological concept, the more people you measure, the better, the more accurate you can be. So what we see is a positive correlation between subjective well-being and all these different things listed on the slide here. People who report a higher subjective well-being feel safer, they feel more confident, they make decisions easier. Doesn't that sound nice? They're more cooperative with other people, they're more patient, they're healthier physically, they have more energy, they have greater life satisfaction, they have healthier relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, friendships. They have a higher positive self-image, and they have a more positive outlook on the future. Doesn't that all sound great? So subjective well-being has a multitude of positive things that it's related to. So this is definitely something we're studying, trying to figure out how we can increase it, figuring out what it is. So one of the ways that we can do this, and it's pretty simple, this is research from Elizabeth Dunn. She is a researcher out at the University of British Columbia, and she wrote a paper a little bit ago on something called the drool factor. So the drool factor is a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that anticipation increases enjoyment. The more and the longer we anticipate something, the more we are going to enjoy that thing when it happens. So the idea here is that you'll spend more time thinking about that thing, and then when it finally gets there, you'll enjoy it more. Use this next time you are planning a vacation or planning a trip. The more you plan it, the earlier you start to plan it, the more you will enjoy that trip. We have the research to back this up. You can also use this in your own life if you're shopping on Amazon. Maybe put those items in your shopping cart and let them sit there for a day or two or three or four. The longer you do that, the more you'll actually enjoy the item once you get it. And that has the added benefit of you thinking to yourself, like, okay, do I actually need my fourth iPad or something like that? You start to realize that, okay, I guess if I've gone this long without it, maybe I don't need it anyway. So that's the Drool factor. Pretty cheap, easy, straightforward way to increase happiness. Now, unfortunately, I want to talk about something called relative deprivation. And this to me is just one of the silliest little things that we do as humans. So this is research from Tim Wadsworth, and he was interested in how our happiness relates to the happiness of others around us. So what Tim found is that there is a positive correlation between subjective well-being and money. Remember, we talked about that last time. We talked about the relationship between money and happiness. It is a positive relationship up until a point, and then we get to that idea of diminishing returns. Tim also found that there is a positive relationship between sex and happiness. The more sex we have, the more happy we tend to be. The more friends we have, the more happy we tend to be. And the more success we have in life, the happier we tend to be. None of that is terribly surprising. But what is surprising is that what he found next, and that is we have less happiness as our friends have more of those things. As our friends, our close associates get more money, we tend to be less happy. As our friends and close associates have more sex, we get less happy. As they have more and more friends than we do, we get less happy. They have more success, we have less happiness. What we find is that we're constantly comparing ourselves to others. So the happier the people around us are, the less happy we tend to be. And that to me is just so sad. That's just so sad that we can't be happy because of the happiness of others. We're constantly engaging in social comparison. And things like Instagram and Facebook make this so much easier to do, and they make this effect so much worse in modern life. All right, and I want to finish today by just talking about a couple different factors and how they relate to happiness. So, studies have been done on each of the different factors listed here: intelligence, parenthood, friendship, so on and so forth, and whether or not they are related to happiness. So, we're asking specifically about a correlation here, not causation, and that's an important distinction to make. So we're not saying that intelligence causes happiness or that happiness causes intelligence. What we're saying is that there is a relationship. We're saying that happiness and intelligence are related somehow. It could be that happiness causes intelligence. It could be that intelligence causes happiness. Or it could be that there's a third factor that we don't know about, that we haven't studied yet, that causes both of them. Just because there's a correlation doesn't mean we can imply a causal relationship. So, with that being said, these factors listed here, do you think there's a correlation between happiness and intelligence? Do you think there's a correlation between parenthood and happiness? Are parents happier? Are they less happy than someone who's not a parent? Friendships, age, how religious someone is, sleep, gender, or physical attractiveness? And we've got the answers on the next slide here. Intelligence? No, there's no relationship between happiness and intelligence. People with high intelligence are just as likely to be happy or unhappy as someone with low intelligence. Parenthood? No, there's no relationship between parenthood and happiness. People who are parents are just as likely to be happy or unhappy as people who don't have children. Friendships? Yes, there is a positive relationship between happiness and friendships. So people who have more friendships tend to be happier people. Age? Yes, and this is actually what we call a U-shaped curve. So what that means is early on in life, we tend to be happy, and then we actually see a decrease in happiness as we get older, and it sort of bottoms out in our early 30s, and after that, it starts to increase again. So what we have is a U-shaped curve. We're happy early on in life, we get less and less happy, we bottom out around our early 30s, and then we start to get happy again, and it increases the older we get. Religiosity, yes. People who are more religious tend to be happier people. Sleep, yes. The more sleep we get, we tend to be happier. Again, we're not saying there's a causal relationship here, but the two are strongly related. Gender, no. Men are just as likely to be happy or unhappy as women. Physical attractiveness, no. People who are physically attractive are just as likely to be happy or unhappy as someone who is not physically attractive. So that is where the research stands at the moment, and that is what I'm going to leave you with today. And again, I just want to encourage you to watch those YouTube videos and maybe put aside 10 minutes to try out meditation. Who knows? Maybe it's the thing for you.